All right, let's take some time to talk about this question. This goes back to uncertainty reduction theory, which we talked about pretty early on into the class. So according to URT, we communicate to reduce blank and blank uncertainty about others. Raise your hand if you picked A, verbal and nonverbal, B, internal and external, C, cognitive and behavioral, or D, contextual and intertextual. All right, so good work. The answer here is cognitive and behavioral. So that's the best answer to this question in terms of defining and understanding URT. This is a theory that goes all the way back pretty early on into the class. So we used uncertainty reduction theory to talk about why we do interpersonal communication, right? So the example of the TV show Catfish is a really good way of looking at URT. You get to know somebody, you're chatting with them, texting them, and so on, but you feel like something's off and you want to get to know them better, so you arrange to meet face-to-face. Turns out they're not at all who they say they are, right? That's an example of using URT in action. Meeting that person face-to-face, designed to reduce the uncertainty that we feel in that interpersonal communication because of the ambiguity that can happen through texting. Cognitive uncertainty, right, is kind of in our own heads, right? It's the idea of people's internal states. You can think of cogs, like cogs in a machine, or the wheels that are turning inside your head. So what's going on internally that makes you uncertain? Whereas behavioral uncertainty, right, is questions about how other people are acting and engaging. So this person says that they're 20 years old and live in this rural neighborhood, but are they actually a 40-year-old guy, right? So that's an important distinction for us to make. Verbal and nonverbal communication gets into what we talked about last week, and we contrasted those. We talked about how verbal is using language, nonverbal is using things such as eye contact, gestures, and so on. Internal and external, not a good answer here because while that might be true, those aren't the main focus areas of URT. Contextual and intertextual, context does matter, but it's not a particular approach used here in URT. So last class, we went over an example short essay question. That question is available on Canvas. I had a request from a couple students. If you are interested in receiving my feedback on that short essay question, or you'd like to redo it and submit a version and say, hey, if I were to take this on the midterm, what grade would I receive on this assignment? You're welcome to let me know, and I'm happy to give you that kind of feedback. One thing that I like to do in practice midterm questions is have at least a couple practice short essay questions. I offer you the opportunity, if you want to submit your practice short essay questions for feedback, you can always do that, and I'll let you know kind of what I'm looking for and what score you would expect to receive on the midterm. So that'll become available for you on Wednesday when I post the study guide and those practice questions. Again, I like to give you a good 2 weeks out from the beginning of the midterm window to do that. We also talked about both verbal and nonverbal communication, right? So one thing to kind of get mastery of as you prepare for the midterm is to get a good sense of types of verbal communication, such as the rules that we use of commas, language, and so on. Nonverbal, both the types of nonverbal communication that we use and the functions, such as substituting, accenting, and so on. So functions are why we do it, and varieties are how we do it. We also took a look at the Sapiens reading, which I know a lot of you weren't able to get to for Friday, but it's an example you can use that talks about how nonverbal communication is incredibly important because every time we sit in a Zoom meeting, we're missing a lot of those nonverbal elements that really shape our communication. In this little rectangle, right, there's so much that we miss in our communication. So for this class, I want us to transition into a discussion of culture, right? So culture is a really large element of the communication we do every day. If this is a topic that is really interesting to you and you want to dive into further, there's a course we teach, intercultural communication. Dr. Chen currently teaches that class, and it's a great way to understand how different cultures communicate with one another. We'll understand some of the different approaches that, depending on culture, people might engage in. And then we'll look at a couple examples of how we communicate across cultures. So today's class is focused more on understanding what culture is and the differences between cultures, whereas Wednesday's class focuses on co-cultural communication, or how we communicate across different cultures or groups. So one way to kind of start thinking about culture is to think about group membership, right? Can I chat with you after class?
What was that?
Can I chat with you after class?
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. So one thing to think about are the groups that you're a member of, right? So you might think about how members of a group or population that you engage with regularly choose to communicate with each other. So for instance, I'd like to see a show of hands again. How many folks are involved in some type of athletic or extracurricular group on campus? Right? So most of you. As part of that group, you have your own code or your own style of speaking. Whether it's the formal rules of the organization or group, such as the way you discuss terminology, maybe you're planning for a game and trying to decide on positions and strategy that you'll execute in the game itself, whether it's the kind of informal rules. So maybe there's an inside joke or history that your group members have, right? One example is when I did speech and debate, we had vocal warm-ups that we do every morning before we go out and compete. And we developed this oral history where different members of the team over time would come up with new tongue twisters and things to say, and they'd kind of take charge of those. So we use that as a way to communicate to new members of the team, this is what our team does, these are the tongue twisters and warm-ups that we do, and it was a way of welcoming and including new members. You might also think about, if you're a member of a religious or spiritual organization, right, the way that your group communicates too. You could think about your own family background. So what are the holidays that you celebrate? How do you celebrate them? What are the traditions that are interesting or particularly important to you, right? So one example is my family would do a thing where on Christmas Eve, we would always open at least one present because we were just too excited for Christmas, and it was just a fun little thing to do. So we developed these traditions, these habits, these behaviors over time, and we use them as an aspect of our communication. So that defines culture, right? So culture is something you've probably heard discussed in a lot of classes. If you've taken anthropology, sociology, in your first year, you've probably heard at least some discussion of culture in one of your other classes, right? So culture is this idea that there is a group of people. So no single person, right, is a culture. Instead, culture is developed by participation in groups, whether it's a sports team, whether it's our family background and heritage, whether it's things such as our nationality or our ethnicity, where are we from. One thing that's become especially common is the use of things like ancestry databases and websites, where people can find information about their ancestors through things such as DNA testing and so on. That's a way that a lot of people try to develop a greater sense of cultural identity. So culture can be a lot of things, right? Culture is not just our nationality, although a lot of times, right, we might strongly associate culture with nationality. So if you feel strongly, right, I'm an American, right, then that can be an element or a way that you might define culture, but that also includes a lot of different components, right? What it might mean to be an American in different parts of the country, right, in a more urban or more rural setting, in terms of things such as gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, right, can mean very, very different things. So even within a larger cultural group, there's a lot of variation in terms of how individuals might express or define themselves, right? Through a process of learning, right? So culture is something that's developed over time. That is, we learn, we engage, we do things such as history, including oral history, in order to develop that culture. So I'll use an example of some of the indigenous groups in the area, right, including the kind of Greater Umatilla Reservation. A lot of indigenous groups in that area have developed over time a process of understanding the land, the resources available, and how they might choose to engage with those resources, right? Another idea here is that this is allowing us to share perceptions of the world. So perception refers to the idea of how we pick up on or understand the world around us. You can think about it again as like a pair of glasses. You take them off, the world looks really different compared to having them on. I have like a blue light filter on my glasses that makes the colors tip kind of differently. In the same way, right, the glasses you wear, the way that you choose to understand and look at the world shapes how you understand that. So if you believe in something like karma, right, the idea that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, then that's going to shape how you feel. Maybe you were rude to a family member, and then the next day you got a flat tire, right? You perceive that as part of this broader idea of karma, and that perception shapes your reality. Beliefs, values, norms, and rules are things we're going to break down over time. But these are different components of how a culture defines itself. And then this eventually affects our behavior. So for a class like interpersonal communication, it impacts us because what we do, how we choose to communicate with other people, is so deeply defined by the cultures that we find ourselves members of and the cultures that we communicate with, right? So I want to break down some of these parts a little bit more, both in terms of beliefs, values, norms, and rules. So I'm going to use an example here in just a minute. But when we break down culture, right, culture contains all four of these things. So the first idea here is a belief, right? It is an assumption or conviction about the world that causes you to believe that this is true, right? So, for instance, do you believe in the idea of karma? Do you believe good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people? Do you believe in a particular interpretation of a god or a spiritual deity or some type of figure, right? Would you consider yourself polytheistic? Or do you believe in multiple kind of gods or rulers, right? So that can really shape how members of a group behave. What are some of the key ideas that your group members believe? One really easy way to understand beliefs is to look at sort of the rules or guiding principles or handbook that might be offered by members of a culture, right? So when you join an extracurricular or athletic group, typically you've signed some type of contract, you've signed an agreement that goes over what's considered to be acceptable behavior, you know, things such as keeping up your grades, letting your professors know classes that you've missed, and so on, right? You use that as a way to reinforce the guiding beliefs of that group. Values, right, refer to important principles and ideas. So one example, right, is, so Colin Powell, former U.S. Secretary of State under the George W. Bush administration, just passed away today, right? Powell was a controversial figure due to his advocacy in the United Nations for the invasion of war in Iraq, right? And one of the key ideas here, and discussed in the context of the war in Iraq, was the idea of freedom versus security, right? So the United States passage of the Patriot Act was an example of a policy that was meant to increase things such as surveillance, wiretapping, and so on, under the argument that that would increase the security of the United States as a whole. We understand that there might be a risk of sort of terrorists or non-state actors engaged in violence, so we should track information. There's also concern or fear that by doing so, that would infringe on certain freedoms or liberties that people would have in terms of sharing information and resources online, right? And that's a debate that carries on to this day. And in many ways, at the core of it is this question of, do we have a larger degree of freedom, or do we do things to compromise that freedom for the sake of things such as national security? In the same way, when we saw the emergence of WikiLeaks, or the leaking of classified U.S. intelligence and information, there's also a values debate about things such as whistleblowing and free information, again, versus things like national security, right? So we oftentimes have different and competing values with one another that shape a lot of our discussions. Again, in terms of a lot of political and social distances that we see in the United States, this oftentimes happens as a result of incredibly different sets of values that different people find to be especially important. One thing that happens in the United States over time is a tracking of a value hierarchy, where the values or beliefs that are most important to people on the basis of things like political orientation, different elements of identity, including gender, race, and so on, right, and tracks those over time. So values you can think about as important things in order to live by. Values can be both instrumental and terminal, right? So an instrumental value is a means to an end. I value money because it helps me to afford food, right? But I might value something like survival as an end to itself, right? Survival is a good thing on its own terms. It's not a means to an end. Additionally, there are norms, right? So these are informal guidelines or rules that affect members of a society or group. So if you go to some type of church or religious group, and you know when you go you should wear your, quote, Sunday best, right? That's choosing clothing and attire that you know aligns with the informal rules and beliefs that members of that culture might have. And then rules are these more explicit guidelines. So while norms are enforced over time and don't necessarily have a hard-coded set of rules, the rules that we use oftentimes affect our interactions in society, right? Again, one common rule in a country such as Japan is that instead of saying no directly, if you don't want to do something, you might say yes, kind of hesitantly. You might say maybe and look your head off to the side. So there's a lot of nonverbal communication that plays a role there. But in many ways, a rule of sort of politeness and respect might impact choosing not to directly say no to something. So, right, the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, right near us, right, and in kind of the Walla Walla area, is an example of these different elements of culture at play. So this reservation includes the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people, right? And among members of these tribes and indigenous groups, there's a variety of different rules and norms and ideas that govern members' behavior. So for instance, one of the guiding beliefs among members of many of these groups is to see things such as the surrounding Blue Mountains and Columbia River as a crucial source of things such as food and security. We've developed a deep heritage and significance to members of these groups, right? Another idea is the importance of values, such as the value of ancestry, culture, and things such as shared history that have become developed over time. In fact, many members of these tribes have actually tried to develop a language program to help younger generations learn the native tongue in a way that might be lost upon newer generations that many ancestors held. One of the norms that we might see, right, is the practice of the Washat or Seventh Drums religion. Also the use of things such as dance as a means of expression might fit under these informal rules. And then as a more formal rule, right, the development of something like a language program that provides clear guidelines for students to help them out. So these are examples of how we can use communication to understand different cultures and the ways that those different cultures put themselves together, right? So when we think about a culture, right, and we think about communication across different cultures, you have both a broader swath as well as some smaller ways to define culture itself, right? So co-culture exists within a culture and has the ability to exert influence over society, right? So you might understand that within something like the United States, there are many different co-cultures or smaller groups. If we were to define a culture as, for instance, American, within American, you would find many co-cultures. You know, what does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be Asian or Pacific Islander American, right? Those kinds of co-cultures define that larger culture or experience. They exist within it, but also seek to change and redefine what that means. So for instance, on a lot of streaming media, you might see collections. Netflix put together a collection a few months ago that was particularly Black American stories. and that might be seen as a co-culture to help us to define and understand its situation within the broader American or United States culture, right? And then a microculture is an even smaller culture within that, right? So a microculture typically is tied to something like location. So for instance, if we were to understand American football as a larger culture, right, we might further divide things up into the league or district. And then a microculture might be, football at Eastern Oregon. So that can be a way to divide up and understand the unique norms or traits that happen within these smaller groups. That also ties into this idea of collective self-esteem. So it's not only that we're members of different groups, but, right, while we have something such as self-image, that's the sort of evaluation of ourselves and our identity, we also have a value judgment, right? We have things like self-esteem to tell us how good or bad we are as a person. And in the same way, we develop a collective self-esteem or a belief in ourselves as members of a group. And that involves us both thinking, is it a good group that we're a part of? And are we good people within that group? Right? So you might think about a sport such as being in a football team and thinking about how within that culture and organization, you might understand yourself and your relationship to this group differently. So that includes 4 parts, right? This is your private collective esteem. So how do you feel about the group? So maybe you're a member of a team and you realize, you know what, this is way different than my high school team. I feel very new. I don't feel like I fit in. I don't know if I like this, right? You might feel kind of negatively about the group and feel like you're not able to fit in. Or maybe you feel really closely tied to your family. You see your family and its own culture and identity as incredibly important to you, right? That's an element of private collective esteem, how you feel about the group. Another idea here, right, is this idea of membership esteem. In other words, are you a good member of the group? So maybe you're a member of a sports team and you feel really good. You score a lot of points for your team, or you have a really good defensive position, and you feel like you've contributed effectively. As a member of your family, maybe you feel like you haven't done a great job of keeping up with them, and keeping contact, keeping up with things like phone calls, and so maybe you don't feel very good about your membership within that group, right? So while the first step is how you feel about the group, membership esteem is how you feel you fit in or behave within that group, right? Again, a lot of teen comedies and coming-of-age stories are very much about this idea of membership esteem. Do you feel like you fit in? Public collective esteem is this idea of whether people outside of the group like you or view your group positively. So for instance, right, if your team has gotten a lot of headlines, if you had a really great weekend and you won a game against a team that was really challenging, so you feel good, you have this positive collective esteem that other people view this group positively, right? You also have a belief that some of the other families or groups or organizations that are near you view your family well, and you have good relationships with other people, right? So whether or not non-members like your group is an incredibly important issue. When we think about things such as refugees, right, and immigration, including places like the United States, this is an incredibly heated topic because in large part of the value or belief that we might be placing on public collective esteem. To what degree, if you consider yourself a refugee, do other people value you and value people like you? And then importance to identity is the idea of how attached we feel to our group, how central the group is to ourselves. So for instance, a couple weeks ago when I had you all use some words to describe yourself, a lot of you chose to put something like athlete first. That was a really big part of you and how you defined yourself. That's great. It also tells me, right, that culture membership might have a really large part of your identity. This goes back to things such as muted group theory as well. Our ability to understand our cultural identity is tied to our ability to use language. So to many of the indigenous groups in places such as the Umatilla Reservation, right, one of the concerns is that the lack of a language program is impacted the degree to which members feel tied to that tribe and that group. So bringing back the language program as a way of combating muted group theory by allowing members of that group to communicate and reclaim many aspects of their language. That might be a way of boosting collective self-esteem because language might be very important to identity. Teaching that language to a new generation allows members of that culture to feel more closely tied to that culture. So, right, we as members of different cultures and groups every day constantly think about how our own membership and identity is a factor. So if, maybe you're a member of an extracurricular or athletic group, but you don't take it super seriously, probably less important to your identity, its group membership does not play a huge role in who you are. Another idea here that's important for us to think about when we're communicating about culture are stereotypes, right? And we hear used stereotypes a lot. It's something that is especially challenging for us as humans who like to find patterns in behavior, right? Stereotypes can be both cultural and personal. So a cultural stereotype is a belief about a culture or a group of people. You might use, slang or language, but in other words, it's providing this blanket assumption about other people and how people might behave. Oftentimes in a way that ignores the actual experiences of members of that group, right? Cultural stereotypes can also be directed toward a person. So as a person, as a member of a group, we might associate that person in a negative way because of the stereotypes that we have, right? So we make these assumptions about other people. One example of how we might use stereotypes was brought up in your book, right? It's the example of seeing different names and associating them with a gender, right? So we see the word flight attendant and we might stereotype or say, oh, it's more likely that we'll associate that with women. Or we see a name such as Mel and we think, oh, that must be a male name, short for Melvin, that's short for Melinda, right? So we might make these all the time, and challenging the stereotypes that our brain oftentimes comes up with is a crucial component to understanding other cultures. This is also this idea of ethnocentrism. So oftentimes, right, as members of cultures, we tend to like what's familiar to us, right? Our brains, you think back to uncertainty reduction theory, we enjoy patterns. Oftentimes we'll flock to, birds of a feather, people that carry similar cultural ideas or are similar to us in certain ways. As a result of this, we oftentimes are fearful of difference, and ethnocentrism is our belief that our own culture might be better than the cultures of other people, right? So saying something such as, the cross-country team is better than the soccer team, right? We're the best team at EOU, right? Can be an example of ethnocentrism because it assumes that one's own group is better than others, right? And one of the problems with this is when we rush to make a judgment about the value or good of one culture relative to another, it keeps us from taking the time to understand and engage with the culture that we might not otherwise be familiar with, right? We also use stereotypes, for instance, right? We might associate masculinity in the United States with things like physical strength, with the color blue. We might associate, right, femininity with the color pink, with an interest in things like princesses and tiaras, right? But we've had some major challenges to those stereotypes and assumptions. But going all the way back to the clothing that we were assigned, right? The toys that we're told to play with, and so on. When I was young, like 3 or 4 years old, I started playing with Barbie. My older sister said, don't play with that, put that away, right? And those are ways that oftentimes different cultures sort of place those stereotypes or roles onto us. Another idea, and this is a larger model in the book, you don't need to copy this down, but it's this idea of context. We'll be getting more into context in just a minute, but key idea is the difference in cultures of high context versus low context, right? Low context, as we talked a little bit about last week, is the idea that what is said is basically direct, that it's transferable and easily translatable. So if I say to you, let's go to the store, and that's all there is to pick up on in that conversation, it's low context. In a high context culture, there's a big emphasis on things such as nonverbal communication, on cues and signals that you can't as easily pick up on or transfer. So you can, if you want, if you haven't already, take some more time to look at this model in your book, but this goes over some of the ways that low and high context differ from one another, right? So low context tends to be explicit, high context is more implicit, right? In a low context culture, you're direct, there's less of a focus on being polite. In a high context, it's very important to be polite and respectful toward other people, right? And you might also understand a spectrum of different contexts in communication. So, for instance, countries like the United States tend to be lower context. We tend to be more direct and use things like nonverbal communication less. Whereas in places such as Brazil, the UAE, and Japan, there's a greater emphasis on context, on how we use nonverbal communication, and how we say something that might differ from the words that we choose to use. So Dr. Stelliton Toomey put forward this idea of face work, right? And face work is especially important in the context of non-Western societies. So as we're thinking about theories in the class, right, face negotiation theory is a really big one to consider because it's this idea that we manage our own relationships to other cultures and our own identity in terms of this idea of saving face, right? That is, we do face work on a regular basis to manage our kinds of relationships. So maybe you have another student and you accidentally spilled some water on their shirt. And you feel incredibly embarrassed and apologetic, right? You do what you can to take responsibility for that. And then the next time you see them, you kind of look away from them or maybe even apologize again. Oftentimes, particularly in non-Western cultures, there's a greater emphasis on saving face, and because many non-Western cultures view harmony and relationships among members of the group as incredibly important, there is a greater emphasis on using face work or saving face as a way of managing the relationships. So what I'd like to have us do now is to look at some different spectrums that we might use in order to define cultures, right? So I'm going to kind of split you up into partnerships or groups of three. And what I'd like each partnership or group of three to look into, you can use this either through your notes on the book. If you have a device, you can use that to look as well. Or some of these spectrums that we use. So for instance, low versus high context, which is what we talked about earlier. Individualism versus collectivism, and so on. So I'm going to assign you, and then after I've assigned you to a partnership or small group, what I'd like you to do is define this spectrum, provide an example of each extreme on this spectrum, and then have your group members' names on that paper. You'll be turning that in later, right? So we already talked about low versus high context, right? The idea that there's subtleties in communication or nonverbal communication that's important. An example of low context is the United States, where we're very direct. An example of high context might be countries such as Japan, where there's a lot of emphasis on our tone and nonverbal language. So why don't we have the four of you over here look at individualism versus collectivism. Let's have the 1, 2, 3 focus on masculinity versus femininity. Let's have 1, 2, 3 focus on low versus high uncertainty avoidance. Let's have the group here in everybody here in these middle rows over here focus on long versus short-term orientation. And then let's focus on, focus here on this side to focus on indulgence versus restraint. So again, I'm asking you as members of the group to define this spectrum, to use an example on each side of the spectrum, and then to write down your group members' names or type them up and turn them in at the end of class.
That's all right.
Or just something.
Sorry, I was like,
What? You got me confused. Stuck up. What the fuck? I have like no capability yet. It's like I don't even know what I'm trying to do.
So I'll give you 2 or 3 more minutes on this. You might have a member of your group who will share.
I was like,
They're not like super
oh, they're not your they came off. I also
I feel like I'm really low.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, I think like sometimes they're kind of nice. They're like good. Kind of just like
Yeah.
like one of my friends, like we went on a trip to 17. We went all the way down. And like me and my other friends are like, we'll do it if you want. Like, Tommy, like, we're kind of hauled it, like, someone. Or what, how many comments? Like just a random.
No. But, yeah.
All right, how many groups would like some more time on this? Okay, I'll give you a couple more minutes.
Well, it had a crack top, so. It probably has more alcohol content. It's like hot. That's great.
Is that all I got?
Oh,
That's the only one.
If you guys think. Oh, sure.
All right, let's go ahead and talk together about some of the things that you were able to come up with and share here so far. So why don't we have each group share the spectrum that they were assigned and then the examples and definition that they came up with here. So let's start over here with this group.
We had individualism and collectivism. It's kind of like communism versus democracy. So the U.S. is number one for individualism, and most Asian countries rely on the collectivism. So the individualism is like the culture is that you have the belief that you can do as you want to, and you can follow your passion instead of thinking like the collectivism culture where they think what can best benefit groups. Yeah.
Okay. How about this group here toward the front?
We had masculinity with femininity. We said how closely it follows gender norms, acting like a stereotypical man or woman. Feminine countries would include Costa Rica and Sweden, and then masculine, the highest scoring one was Japan and the UK.
All right. This group back here.
We had low versus high uncertainty. Avoidance pretty much is like the difference between somebody who's like more relaxed and spontaneous versus like a type A person who needs those rules and those guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I like how you kind of contextualize that to an individual example. Work over here.
We had long-term versus short-term orientation, and long-term is just focused on the future, short-term is focused on the present and the past. And one thing, long-term highlights is being persistent, working hard for your future, and thrifting so you can have that financial cushion. And then short-term is pretty much the opposite. And an example of long-term with like Asian countries like China and Taiwan and Japan. And short-term is like United States falls 31 out of like 39th, I think. And then Pakistan and the Czech Republic is also short-term.
Yeah. And then this group over here on the end.
We had indulgence and restraint, so basically countries like Canada, us, and like Australia, they kind of just place a more like importance on enjoying life and fulfilling your desires and like value freedom of speech. Where compared to like restraint is more like the Indian and kind of like Asian like cultures of like basically you have this kind of fulfilling your desires.
Yeah. So these are some good examples, right? Just a couple things that I would add here, right? Individualism versus collectivism, the achievement of the person, right? And things such as individual success versus the success of the group. A lot of times where collectivist cultures have larger populations, so achieving kind of the needs or harmony of the group tends to be a lot more important. Masculinity versus femininity, right, is not only something we can define in terms of an individual culture, but also how a culture defines masculinity or femininity can look very, very different, right? So what does it mean to be masculine or to be male? Can mean a lot in terms of clothing, behaviors, attire, and so on, depending on the country and the situation. Uncertainty avoidance, right, is not only a part of uncertainty reduction theory, but the idea, right, that as the group brought up, we tend to avoid interactions with things that we're not certain about, right? So if we are very anxious or have high uncertainty avoidance, we tend to avoid interacting much with outgroups or people outside of our own culture. Our short-term or long-term orientations are very much how we tie ourselves to time, right? So long-term orientation is really focused on the future, planning ahead, and so on. And then, as the last group got up, indulgence versus restraint might be to what degree things such as formal rules dictate the interpersonal communication that we do. So these different spectrums are ways of thinking about and defining different cultures. You can think about this not just in terms of nationality and countries, but also some of the examples that you all brought up in terms of individual behavior. So if you're an outgoing person versus more of an introvert, right? So those things are going to inform how you might approach this. So we'll talk more next class about some of the ways that this ties to culture and to identity. So to bring together things we talked about today, right? Culture has shared experiences, norms, rules, and so on. It can be measured in terms of our membership to groups, and how closely we associate with those groups. And it can be considered in terms of our spectrum related to communication, individualism versus collectivism, high or low context, and so on. So for next class, we're going to explore these issues in more detail. There's only a very short 5 or 6 pages. I will also be posting the midterm study guide and practice questions before Wednesday's class. And as we think about next class, you might think to yourself, what does it mean to communicate across cultures? How do we engage in intercultural communication? So go ahead and pass forward or email the activity I asked you to work on for today. And have a great Monday.